John Wayne was an icon of the silver screen during the golden age of Hollywood, starring in hundreds of movies throughout his over 50-year-long career. He was known for his portrayal of a stoic, tough guy cowboy in Western movies, as well as his unmistakable presence in World War epics and police dramas. When he died in 1979, tributes started pouring in, saying that an era of motion picture making had ended with his death, and there could never be another John Wayne. But it didn't take long for reports to start cropping up that maybe his death wasn't the final curtain call for the Duke. Witnesses in the places that he was particularly fond of in life, like the Alamo and his beloved yacht, the Wild Goose, they started mentioning the feeling of a presence, with some saying that they had actually seen the tall, shadowy outline of a rugged man wearing a cowboy hat. But has John Wayne really come back after death to the places that he loved in life? So John Wayne is in fact not his real name. He was born Marion Robert Morrison on the 26th of May 1907 in Winterset, which is in Iowa. When he was a kid though, the Morrison family moved to California, and it was during this time where he would get his nickname Duke, which stuck for the rest of his life. He had a pet dog, an Airedale Terrier, whose name was Duke, and as Marion would walk to school, his dog would follow him. We used to have the same thing with our cat. He'd love a little morning walk up to my primary school, but then we'd have to shoo him back home because the school was on a main road and he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box, being a ginger boy, bless him. But anyway, Duke the dog didn't go all the way to school with Marion. He'd stop at the local fire station that was on the way. Duke the dog would wait there, Marion would carry on to school, spend the day there, and then on his way home, Duke would rejoin him and they'd walk back home together. And so, because of this little ritual that the dog had gotten into, the crew at the fire station knew the dog's name, but not Marion's. And so they began referring to the dog as Big Duke and Marion as Little Duke. Much preferring the name Duke to Marion, the nickname stuck. As he got older, Duke attended the University of Southern California, majoring in pre-law on a football scholarship. But the entire trajectory of his life would completely change when he got a summer job for a film production company, Fox Film Corporation. He started off just doing little bits and pieces, like being the guy in charge of props and things like that, and eventually became an extra in some films. His first few appearances, starting with playing a football player in the film Brown of Harvard in 1926, they were uncredited, literally just a guy in the background. But his first credited role, where he went by the name Duke Morrison, was Words and Music in 1929. But around that time, he ended up actually losing his football scholarship to USC after a shoulder injury, so he couldn't play football. Kinda need to be able to do that to continue going to school on a football scholarship, so a career in law was looking less and less likely. But hauling around props and equipment and playing the occasional bit role just wasn't going to cut it career-wise either, until in stepped Raoul Walsh. And he had big, huge plans for his next movie, The Big Trail. The only problem was, he didn't have someone to play his leading role, Breck Coleman. Walsh had wanted Tom Mix or Gary Cooper to play the part, who were two huge movie stars at the time, who were both well used to acting in Western films, but neither of them were available. One day though, Walsh noticed Duke, this young lad who was working on the set of another Fox film production, and he just saw something in him. The way he carried himself, his demeanour, there was something there that he could use in this movie. And so The Big Trail in 1930 became the first movie where Duke played the starring role. Although, before we can release this, we really need to work on that name Marion Morrison. It's just not going to work in Hollywood, son. And so it was originally proposed that Duke would be given the name Anthony Wayne, as Walsh was apparently a really big fan of Mad Anthony Wayne, a military officer in the American Revolutionary War. But that it didn't seem quite right. But when the first name John was volunteered, that was when the name John Wayne had been created, without the guy even being in the room. But this was what he would go by for the rest of his career. The Big Trail didn't do super well in the box office though, and so it wasn't quite the big break that John Wayne needed. He went on to star in multiple other B-movie westerns throughout the 30s though, but in 1939 he was offered the lead role for director John Ford's next project, Stagecoach. And that was it. John Wayne was a Hollywood star. And from that point on, it was only up from here. He was most well known for his western movies, but he did World War II epics, playing soldiers, he did police dramas, romantic comedies, he even did one horror film as well. But over his career, he starred in literally hundreds of movies. The numbers vary depending on which source you use, but it looks to be at least 170, some places say it's north of 200. Either way, John starred in a lot of movies. But one thing I found quite cool was, through my research, I found so many different people sharing what their favourite John Wayne film was. And the answers were so varied. It seemed like almost everyone had a different answer, why they preferred one film to another, having childhood memories associated with a particular film, like all of these things. But it kind of just showed the scope of John Wayne's influence at the time. He was this huge star. And before we go any further and start chatting about his ghost, there is one thing from John Wayne's life that I need to tell you about. Because apparently, the Duke had a paranormal experience of his own back in the 50s. And this took place at the Hotel Monte Vista in Flagstaff, Arizona. Because Flagstaff was so close to places like Docia and Oak Creek Canyon, where they were filming a lot of westerns in the 40s and 50s, the Hotel Monte Vista was perfectly suited for a big-name cast to stay while they were out shooting their next production. And so it was during one of these stays at the Hotel Monte Vista that John Wayne potentially encountered one of the hotel's many infamous ghosts. He was apparently staying in room 210 at the time when he experienced the entity known as the Phantom Bellboy. And the story goes that this bellboy will knock on the doors to guest rooms and call out room service, but when you go and open the door, there'll be no one there. No one in the corridors, not a soul about, but it's still easy to dismiss as just kids messing about or what have you, I guess, right? Only sometimes, some guests have claimed that when they've opened the door to see who's been knocking, they will see the misty outline of a bellboy. Definitely not a real staff member, this guy is a ghost. Don't think he's going to be able to help you with your bags. And so apparently, John Wayne may have experienced this entity, as it said that he once opened the door of his room, 210, after he heard someone knocking on it. Like so many other witnesses before him though, there was no one there. But there was what John reported as this presence. You know when you just know that someone is standing behind you, your gut just knows? A bit like that, only this person was right in front of him. John went on to say that he didn't feel threatened or anything like that, and it actually felt friendly. Maybe just wanted to meet the big movie star but was too shy to materialise properly. But beyond that, in 1964, John Wayne would receive the news that he was diagnosed with lung cancer at age 57. His 6-pack-a-day habit had caught up to him. 6 packs of smokes a day though, like how do you find the time for all of those cigarettes? Anyway, at the time, it was still a bit of a taboo thing to talk about, especially when it came from this macho persona that John Wayne had crafted throughout his career. And the studios wanted him to keep hush-hush about his diagnosis, but he didn't listen. He went on to have some ribs and his left lung completely removed, and was declared cancer-free, and went back to work, filming movies like Hellfighters and The Green Berets. But he also became a very passionate advocate for people to go and get early checkups. If something's not quite right, go and get it looked at and things like that. But after being cleared of cancer once, his health was never quite the same again. Obviously, going about your day-to-day life with one lung is gonna do that to you. He also underwent open heart surgery to replace his mitral valve in 1978, which was a success. But on the 12th of January 1979, during an operation to remove his gallbladder, they found cancerous tissues in his stomach, and so the surgery turned into this 9.5-hour operation to remove his stomach as well. On the 3rd of May, he was back in hospital to remove an obstruction in his intestine, during which it was clear that he needed more than just surgery. He needed chemotherapy, and they wanted to try this experimental drug as well, if he was going to have any sort of chance of beating this again. He stayed in hospital after that op, trying to build up the strength to undergo chemo, but he wouldn't make it. On the 11th of June at 5:30 p.m, surrounded by his family, John Wayne passed away, aged 72, with the cause of death being officially listed as complications from cancer. Some people believed that it wasn't just the drinking, smoking, and decades of grueling work that had killed him though, because in 1954, John Wayne had starred in the movie The Conqueror, which had been filmed in the Escalante Desert and Snow Canyon, Utah. And that's an important detail to know where it was filmed, because the year before that, almost 140 miles east, the US Atomic Energy Commission had been testing nuclear weapons in Yucca Flat, Nevada, and the radioactive fallout from those detonations had been blown downwind, right to about where that movie was going to be filmed. By 1980, it was found that 91 of the 220 cast and crew members who'd been present during the filming had contracted cancer, with 46 going on to pass away from it, which is a scary amount, right? But while it does seem a lot for almost half the cast and crew to die from cancer, and so yes, there definitely could have been a link there, really, it was apparently totally in line with the odds for developing cancer at the time. I mean, a lot of these people were heavy chain smokers. That's gonna dramatically increase your risk, especially for developing cancer earlier in your lifetime. Not to mention that the movie was filmed in 1954 and the numbers came back in 1980. That's almost 30 years. But then again, spending extended amounts of time in a place where nuclear bombs had been detonated and then the radioactive fallout had settled not that long ago, plus then having some of that same dirt shipped into the studio afterwards for reshoots and things? Yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts on that one. But since John Wayne's death, his ghost has apparently been spotted in multiple locations that meant a lot to him in life, with one of those being the Alamo. And the Alamo was built as part of the Catholic mission in the Spanish Empire, where they tried to convert the indigenous population in the 1700s as part of their colonization. But what it's probably best known for is being the site of the 1836 Battle of the Alamo, a super important battle in the Texas Revolution, a fight for Texas to gain independence from Mexico. The Battle of the Alamo was a bloody siege which lasted for 13 days and resulted in Mexican forces taking the Alamo. All 189 Texan defenders officially listed were killed, including David Crockett, Jim Bowie, and William B. Travis. And most of the estimates say that the Mexicans lost around 600 men, but others say it could have been as many as 1,600. Either way, just a huge loss of life. In 1960, John Wayne directed his first movie based on this battle, called The Alamo, where he also played Davy Crockett. And being such a stickler for the details, he wanted to get the accuracy of this production just right. He would visit the Alamo multiple times. He'd take the tours, speak to experts, he would study the blueprints so that he could have a set built that was as close to the original as possible. Just all of these things. He spent a lot of time here. And the Alamo would have been such a significant film for John. He personally financed a lot of it as he couldn't get the investment he needed anyway. He was a big shot movie star, but totally unproven as a director, and it was just extremely important to him to get the details right to pay tribute to the fallen soldiers. And so apparently not long after his death in 1979, some staff and visitors claimed to have encountered John Wayne visiting the Alamo once more. And it is a big, apparently though, as I didn't come across any specific witnesses who had extra details to share, what his apparition was doing, or anything like that. But a San Antonio medium claimed that John Wayne does regularly visit the Alamo around once a month or so, and that it rejuvenates him in some way. He comes and chats to the fallen soldiers, as the place is reputed to be extremely haunted by the men who were there at the battle, which is perhaps unsurprising to no one. But again, came from a medium, no other witness reports, so however you feel about mediums, you are free to make up your own mind on that information. It doesn't look like we can get any answers through any other means though, as I believe paranormal investigations aren't allowed at the Alamo, and I get it. It is a place of reverence anyway. It's a registered historical site that's looked after by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, and it is very much a memorial to those who lost their lives. It's a place of contemplation, of reflection, of preserving the memory of those men. And so being such a sacred site, and John Wayne having such a high regard for the soldiers that died defending it, potentially he could still hang around here after death, maybe. But there is one place above all else where he is said to frequent, his beloved yacht, the Wild Goose. John Wayne bought his pride and joy in 1962 for $116,000, and after a bit of a renovation, the boat became his home away from home, a place to entertain friends and spend time with his family. The Wild Goose had originally been a minesweeper used by the US Navy during World War II, but the 136-foot yacht was converted to include 5 staterooms plus a saloon. And John owned the Wild Goose for 17 years, docking at Newport Beach Harbour, not too far away from his waterfront home. But he'd take the boat to Mexico in the winter, go to Alaska in the summer, he just loved being out on the water. He swore he would never sell the boat, but about a month before his death in 1979, I'm pretty sure he could see the writing on the wall, he started getting his affairs in order and put the Wild Goose up for sale. Lynn Hutchins, an attorney from Santa Monica, was straight in there. As a fan of John Wayne, he was desperate to own this iconic yacht. He went through quite a bit of negotiations. John Wayne wasn't just going to let the Wild Goose go to anyone. And so when the keys were finally handed over to Lynn, he just couldn't believe it. He owned John's boat. The boat. Not only that, but a lot of John Wayne's possessions actually stayed on the boat, like portraits, furniture, things like that. Obviously, not too much long after the sale, John Wayne passed away. But then according to Lynn, weird things started to happen on board the Wild Goose. He claimed that the first time he slept on the boat, he knew things were going to be a bit strange. He was apparently woken up to the sound of someone walking on the deck above him where he was sleeping, thinking that was very odd, especially considering he was the only one on board at the time. He obviously wanted to go and investigate. Who on earth has broken in and is wandering around upstairs, He walked the entirety of the boat, but doesn't see a single soul. There is no one about, which is a bit odd, but, there is so much wood panelling everywhere. You're on a boat, so you're slightly moving all the time anyway. Could be something like that, right? Still, it stuck in Lynn's mind, and so the next morning he spoke to the yacht engineer, who had actually been employed by John Wayne, so he knew all about his routines and things from when he was on board. The engineer said it was funny Lynn should mention it, and this might be unrelated, but you do know John Wayne used to walk 20 laps on that deck every night, just to make sure he got a bit of exercise in. And so from then on, Lynn claimed that every time he stayed on the Wild Goose, he would hear those footsteps. But it would get weirder. In August 1979, John Wayne passed away in June, so it's really not been that long at this point, Lynn was, again, staying on the Wild Goose. It was about 4 in the morning, dawn was just about to break, but when nature calls, so he'd just been to the bathroom. As he walked from the bathroom back to bed, he was stopped in his tracks, as he noticed someone standing in the doorway out to the portside gangway. He described them as being super tall, filling out almost the entire doorway. And while it was dark, there was still enough light for him to see that the figure had a bit of a half smile, and that he was wearing what was unmistakably a cowboy hat. He went on to say that this figure was all grey, but completely solid, and he was looking directly at Lynn. And just like that, after about 3 or 4 seconds, the figure completely vanished, leaving Lynn Hutchins in utter shock as to what he had just seen. He got chatting to the former yacht captain after that encounter, Bert Minshall, who had worked for John Wayne on the Wild Goose for 16 years, and all he could say was, yep, that was John Wayne. But he would potentially be seen again and again, and not just by Lynn. There was one story where Lynn's wife was stepping out of the shower, and apparently there was the big tall shadowy figure of a man standing in the doorway again, who promptly disappeared, hopefully on understanding what he had just walked into. A bit like, oh sorry, my bad, I'll go haunt somewhere else for a bit. And then there was a really interesting encounter that Lynn had on the boat, this time about a year or so after John Wayne had died, and he was just sat in the main saloon, chilling out, reading a book with his back to the doorway. All very civilised, right? All of a sudden, he got that feeling again, where you just know someone's behind you, that gut instinct. As he turned around to see who it was, this gust of wind shot through the saloon out of nowhere, and the collection of John Wayne's beer glasses, which were hanging over the bar, began to shake and clink together. Obviously, that is incredibly concerning to Lynn. He didn't want these beer glasses to smash. These were incredible value to him, coming from John Wayne himself. But as he looked over to where they were, he couldn't help but notice something in the mirror that was hanging up behind the bar. He wasn't alone. He could see his reflection, but then there was someone else there, a much taller man with a rugged face and a Stetson hat on. And as he was looking in the mirror, he could see that this figure was standing right behind him, staring at him. Obviously, he spun around as fast as he could, noticing this extra person in the saloon with him, but there was no one there. So he turned back to the mirror and saw that the phantom cowboy had gone, and that Lynn's reflection was alone in the mirror again. But throughout all of this, Lynn Hutchins never felt threatened or scared. When he was on the boat, he kind of felt the opposite. He felt this protective warmth whenever he was on the yacht, so he was never particularly fussed about the strange goings-on. To his mind, he was convinced it was haunted by John Wayne anyway, which was a-okay for Lynn, being such a fan. In the 80s, Lynn had a group come out to the Wild Goose to see if he could get any more answers as to what was going on. There was William G. Roll, a parapsychologist, as well as Patricia Hayes, a psychic medium. William Roll, he was obviously interested in getting to the bottom of whether it actually was John Wayne and whether he truly had returned to his boat after death, but he was most interested in the one thing at the centre of almost all of the activity, the common denominator, Lynn Hutchins himself. Because William Roll raised the excellent point that it's not hard to see the emotional attachment that Lynn has to John Wayne. Apparently, just talking to Lynn, you can feel as though he felt John Wayne was one of the family. It was obviously such a source of pride that him and the actor shared this connection through the boat. And so maybe also there was a little bit of influence from the yacht crew who kind of went along with the stories for him. But really, it wasn't too difficult for Lynn to connect any strange activity with John Wayne. He'd not long passed away, the Wild Goose was his pride and joy. It's got to be his ghost coming back to his home away from home, right? And I think this side of the argument really gathers a little bit of credibility in that with Lynn's encounters, he's always seen as a figure wearing a cowboy hat. Yes, John Wayne was a cowboy, he had ownership in a few ranches, but he was most known for playing a cowboy. You say John Wayne to anyone in the street and they'll think of the westerns that he starred in. Whereas when he was on the Wild Goose, out with his family or entertaining friends, he wouldn't have been in that cowboy getup. A lot of the time, he would have gone out on the boat wearing what you'd wear to go sailing. He'd have a skipper's cap on. Sure, sometimes he was in a Stetson, but do you know what I mean? And so William Roll reasoned that maybe this figure that Lynn had spotted was, again, Lynn just seeing what he wanted to see, what he associated John Wayne, the persona, to look like, rather than the actual ghost of John Wayne. But who knows, maybe it was because of this this emotional connection with the yacht, and by extension of that, John Wayne, which led to him having these experiences in the first place. Because there was a story of like a little bit of a synchronicity when Lynn had spotted some brass hurricane lamps that he absolutely loved the look of. He'd seen them in this secondhand shop and thought they'd be perfect for the boat, and so he'd picked them up and taken them back to the Wild Goose to be installed in the galley. As soon as the engineer saw those lamps, he said to Lynn, "You know that we had those lamps hanging up here before, but we had to take them down because John would always hit his head on them, being 6'4" and whatnot." They still had the old ones in storage below deck, and when they went to go and look at the originals, they were exactly the same as the ones that Lynn had bought. And I mean, I know a hurricane lamp is a hurricane lamp, they're effectively the same, but then there are so many different tiny little variations. So it's a very interesting little coincidence that Lynn had picked up the exact same ones that John Wayne had taken down. As for what the psychic medium Patricia Hayes thought about the Wild Goose, she was adamant that John Wayne was definitely still there on the boat. It was one of his favourite places in life, and it's still one of his favourite places in death. He loves hanging out there. She also went on to say that allegedly John Wayne knew that he was dead and he wasn't trapped here or anything like that, didn't need an exorcism on the boat, and so he's not there all of the time. He's still a busy man in death, so it seems, still got other places to go, people to see. Lunch date with the Alamo fellas, maybe? In the 90s, Lynn Hutchins sold the Wild Goose to the events company called Hornblower Cruises and Events, where you could then hire out the boat for functions and things like that. But even without Lynn on board, the paranormal activity seemed to carry on. Passengers on the boat, particularly women, would report that the bathroom doors would lock themselves without any explanation, and it didn't specify whether they were locked in or out of the bathrooms. That could change the entire context of that story. There was an ice machine that used to be on the Wild Goose, and after it was taken off, a guy called Josh Reeves, the events manager and maitre d', claimed that he could still hear it. I'm assuming he meant he could hear ice falling in the machine, maybe? That is such a specific thing to hear, though. He also went on to say that other staff members from Hornblower Cruises report hearing their names being called, even though there's no one else around. The company chef was once on board alone one night, probably cleaning down after an evening event or something, and he said he saw a flickering light, almost like a candle, flashing away to itself in the main saloon. He knew he was alone though, and I'm pretty sure that there would be rules about having naked flames burning if it was something left over from the event, and so he just noped straight out of there and left. But it doesn't all seem to be that benign. There was one story where a former captain had been so terrified by what had happened to him that he refused to set foot on the boat alone afterwards. The captain had been asleep in what had been John Wayne's bedroom when all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, he felt some unseen force throw him out of bed. Initially, he wasn't even going to return to the Wild Goose at all, but eventually came back, albeit never on his own. And even when the boat is empty, activity is still reported. Although, it's a bit like if a tree falls in the woods thing. If there's a bump in the night and no one's around to hear it, did it make a sound? Anyway, there was one instance where a captain of another boat reported seeing some of the lights on in the stateroom of the Wild Goose, which was odd because it was real late. There was no one on board. It was significant enough for him to take notice of, you know? And so he noted it and mentioned it to the guys the morning after, like, "Oh, I think you forgot to turn some lights off last night." But when they checked, the gate to the dock was still locked, so no one had been in and turned the lights off or anything. Yet when they went to the stateroom, all the lights were switched off. And then there was one really bizarre story that I came across, where one night the Wild Goose somehow slipped its lines and floated out across the bay where it had stopped, right outside John Wayne's old home. When they got on board, there was no evidence that anyone had been in the pilot house or the engine room. The lines hadn't been cut or snapped, like nothing like that. And so people started thinking that perhaps John Wayne had taken the Wild Goose out one more time. And with this one, I don't know, maybe the yacht hadn't been tied down properly. That seems like the most rational explanation there. But to just drift, and then to allegedly stop right outside John Wayne's old house, if true, seems very strange, doesn't it? I don't know, maybe the wind was blowing that direction, anything like that. Even so, very interesting story anyway. And so while Hornblower Cruises went through some financial trouble, I think they got bought out. They rebranded to City Cruise or City Experiences and still own the Wild Goose today. So if you fancy getting married on John Wayne's old yacht, that is a thing you can do. But whether you decide to host your nuptials on a converted World War II minesweeper or before you make the trip to pay your respects to the fallen soldiers of the Alamo. Maybe you might end up in the presence of a long-dead movie star. If you truly believe that he is actually still hanging around, of course. Do you think he visits the Alamo from time to time? Do you reckon he's back on board his beloved yacht? Or do you think he's somewhere else? I saw some rumours of him potentially haunting the old Tucson Studios, which is where he filmed some of his westerns, but there weren't any specific stories that were significant enough to include here. Or do you not believe any of it? Whatever your opinion, I always love seeing people's perspectives in the comments. I think John Wayne, similarly to Elvis Presley when we chatted about him last year, he was a global superstar of the time. He was instantly recognisable, this huge name, this larger-than-life character, and so because of that, potentially it's not, say, the spirit of John Wayne, and maybe it's more of a residual thing. Especially with the Wild Goose. People coming aboard most likely know whose boat it was, and even if you don't, you soon get to know because of all the pictures and memorabilia all around the place on it. It's almost like it's priming you to see a ghostly figure wearing a cowboy hat that you then instantly associate with John Wayne himself. Obviously the Alamo, that already had a reputation of being haunted before John Wayne passed away, so that could explain any stories there. The Wild Goose, it was also in service during World War II, a very turbulent time. I didn't come across any stories of deaths on board or anything like that, but that could also be an explanation for activity there. Just a thought. But as always, let me know what you think. I did really enjoy the research for this one. It's always interesting looking into celebrity hauntings. I find them absolutely fascinating. So if you've got any suggestions for celebrities you might want me to cover at some point, please do let me know. I did keep on getting caught up in the search for John Wayne Gacy's ghost, the killer clown serial killer. Turns out apparently he gets around a lot in death as well. But there was something else I came across in my research on John Wayne, the actual John Wayne, and I wanted to mention it because I had no idea before this. I had been aware that John Wayne had this character of being the patriotic American, ruthlessly committed to his principles, a symbol of the rugged, red-blooded American spirit and all of that, but I can't make an episode about John Wayne without mentioning his political views for the homophobic and racist comments he made publicly, particularly towards black people and Native Americans. And I know a lot of people who are fans of the guy will say that, oh, it was just different attitudes of the time, find a celebrity from that era that hasn't had a controversial take on something or other, and we can't hold them to the standards that we have now. It was an earlier, less informed generation. And that's fine, but his answers in a now infamous Playboy magazine interview in 1971, talking about believing in white supremacy until black people had reached what he called a point of responsibility, or not thinking that taking land from Native Americans was wrong because they selfishly wanted to keep it all to themselves. Those views were extremely harsh, even for the 70s. So I just wanted to mention it because it was something new that I'd learned. I had no idea of it before, and it definitely changed how I saw the guy. Yeah, racism is bad. But that is a conversation getting a bit further than the scope of my little YouTube channel on history and ghost stories, of which we will be getting back to next time. I have a good old haunted house from the UK to tell you about. I say house, it is a very big, very old mansion. Lots to tell you about there. So if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know by hitting the like button. And if you fancy sticking around for the next one and you're not already subscribed, maybe you'd like to do that too. No pressure. It would be cool to see you again for another one though. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water. All of this talk of filming westerns and I can practically feel the desert sand in my mouth, though that is probably more to do with me talking at you for ages. Stay hydrated please, folks. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. But has John Wayne really come back after... Oh dear, was that a little bit of a sneeze?